In 1998, a document leaked from inside Microsoft that was never supposed to see the light of day. It wasn't a product roadmap, it wasn't a strategy deck, it was a confession written by a Microsoft engineer named Vinod Valapillil that admitted in plain corporate English what the most powerful software company on Earth had been denying for years. A free operating system built by volunteers with no budget and no board of directors was winning. 3 numbers. 78% of the world's web-facing servers run Linux today. 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers run Linux. And when Microsoft killed Windows 10 support in October 2025, over 780,000 users migrated to Linux in a single documented wave, just through one distribution called Zorin OS. But here's the part Microsoft doesn't put in the press releases. They didn't just lose to Linux. They spent 30 years and hundreds of millions of dollars actively trying to destroy it. They leaked fear into boardrooms. They secretly funded a $1 billion lawsuit. They paid hardware manufacturers to lock Linux off every new PC sold. Their own CEO went on national television and called it a cancer. None of it worked. And the reason it didn't work is the reason this story matters more than any corporate rivalry you've ever heard of. If you want to understand how a free piece of software built by a 21-year-old college student in Helsinki survived everything the richest company in tech threw at it, hit subscribe. Because Money Legends doesn't let big tech rewrite the story. To understand why Microsoft was terrified, you have to go back to 1991. Helsinki, Finland. A 21-year-old computer science student named Linus Torvalds was frustrated. He had an Intel 80386 PC, and he wanted a real operating system, not MS-DOS, not the expensive Unix systems that only corporations could afford, so he built one himself. On August 25, 1991, he posted a message to a Usenet news group that may be the most understated announcement in tech history. "I'm doing a free operating system," he wrote. "Just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU." The FTP admin who hosted the files renamed his project Linux. By 1994, Linux 1.0 was released. By 1996, it was running web servers. By 1998, the same year that Halloween Memo leaked, Linux was powering the infrastructure of companies like Google, which had just been founded, and Amazon, which was 3 years old. This was not a hobby anymore, this was a movement, and it was free. Not free as in cheap, free as in anyone could use it, modify it, distribute it, and build on it. No license fees, no vendor lock-in, no Microsoft tax. The business model that had made Bill Gates a billionaire selling software licenses was being challenged by something that cost nothing. And the people building it weren't doing it for money. They were doing it because they believed software should belong to everyone. Microsoft had a $20 billion revenue machine. Linux had a Usenet post and a GPL license, and somehow Linux was winning. In October 1998, Eric S. Raymond, one of the most prominent voices in the open source world, received a leaked copy of a confidential Microsoft memo. He published it online with annotations. Microsoft confirmed it was real. Then they tried to minimize it. They called it an engineering study. Not official policy, just one engineer's opinion. That was a lie. The Halloween documents, there were eventually 11 of them, laid out Microsoft's entire anti-Linux strategy in clinical detail. The plan had 3 pillars. First, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Spread the message that Linux was unreliable, unsupported, legally risky, and too complicated for enterprise use. Make CIOs afraid to deploy it. Make IT managers afraid to recommend it. Second, protocol lock-in. Microsoft would extend its proprietary protocols in file sharing, in email, in networking to make Linux incompatible with Windows environments. If your company ran Windows, switching to Linux would break everything. That was the point. Third, patents and litigation. The memos explicitly discussed using intellectual property claims to slow Linux development, not because Microsoft had a legitimate case, but because legal threats are expensive to defend, and open source projects don't have legal departments. What they promised publicly, we compete on merit, may the best product win. What they were planning internally, deny Linux the oxygen of credibility, compatibility, and legal safety. Microsoft's own engineers estimated in those same memos that Linux's total cost of ownership was lower than Windows in key enterprise scenarios, a finding they buried while publicly claiming the opposite. The FUD campaign worked, for a while. But by 2003, Linux was growing faster than ever. Red Hat was a public company. IBM had invested $1 billion in Linux development. The enterprise world was moving. Microsoft needed a new weapon, so they found one, and they funded it in secret. In March 2003, a small Utah company called the SCO Group filed a $1 billion lawsuit against IBM. The claim: IBM had illegally contributed SCO's proprietary Unix code into the Linux kernel. If SCO won, every company running Linux could be liable. The entire open source ecosystem was suddenly under legal threat. The Linux community smelled something wrong immediately. SCO had no real evidence. Their legal claims were thin, but they had money. Suddenly, mysteriously, a lot of it. Here's what we now know. In 2003, Microsoft purchased a Unix license from SCO for $16.6 million, for patents SCO didn't actually own. Then, in October 2003, a venture firm called Baystar Capital invested $50 million in SCO to fund the IBM lawsuit. Baystar's own spokesman later confirmed the investment came on Microsoft's direct introduction. A leaked SCO internal email from consultant Mike Anderer alleged Microsoft had helped raise up to $86 million through Baystar and other channels. In 2006, Baystar founder Lawrence Goldfarb stated under oath that a Microsoft senior vice president had personally urged him to invest in SCO and promised to guarantee Baystar's investment against losses. Microsoft's translation: "We can't beat Linux in the market, so we'll try to make it legally toxic." The SCO lawsuit dragged on for years. It terrified enterprise buyers. It created exactly the uncertainty Microsoft's Halloween documents had called for. And then, in August 2007, a federal judge ruled that Novell, not SCO, owned the Unix copyrights SCO had been suing over. The entire case collapsed. SCO filed for bankruptcy the next month. Linux kept growing. While the lawyers were fighting, Microsoft's leadership was waging a public campaign. In 2000, Steve Ballmer compared the open source movement to communism. A year later, in June 2001, he sat down with the Chicago Sun-Times and delivered the line that would follow him for the rest of his career. He called Linux a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. This wasn't a slip, this was strategy. Ballmer was the most powerful voice in enterprise software, and he was telling every CIO in America, Linux is legally dangerous. Linux is ideologically radical. Linux is not safe for your company. Imagine you're an IT director at a Fortune 500 company in 2002. You're considering Linux for your server infrastructure. You could save millions in licensing fees. Your engineers love it. But the CEO of Microsoft just called it a cancer on national television. Your board is nervous. Your legal team is nervous. You stick with Windows. Now multiply that fear by 10,000 companies. That was the plan. But Microsoft didn't stop there. They went after the hardware. Internal Microsoft documents revealed the company had pressured Acer, one of the world's largest PC manufacturers, to abandon plans to pre-install Linux on netbooks. Microsoft offered Acer discounted Windows licenses in exchange for keeping Linux off their machines. The numbers don't lie. In 2007, Linux had less than 1% desktop market share. Windows had 95%. Microsoft's OEM agreements covered over 90% of new PC sales. Linux was effectively locked out of the consumer market before users ever saw it. Here's the irony Microsoft never saw coming. Every weapon they used against Linux made Linux stronger. The FUD campaign forced the open source community to document everything, build enterprise support structures, and create companies like Red Hat that could provide the corporate backing Microsoft said Linux lacked. The SCO lawsuit forced the Linux Foundation to create a legal defense fund and establish clear IP provenance for every line of kernel code. The hardware lockout pushed Linux developers to build better drivers, better compatibility, and eventually a gaming platform that would crack the consumer market wide open. In 2009, Microsoft contributed more than 20,000 lines of code to the Linux kernel. Hyper-V drivers submitted under the GPL. By 2011, they were one of the top 5 corporate contributors to Linux. Not because they wanted to, because their Azure cloud platform was growing and customers were choosing Linux. Read that again. The company that called Linux a cancer was building its most profitable new business on top of it. The trajectory was relentless. By 2016, a third of Azure virtual machines ran Linux. By 2017, 40%. By 2019, Linux surpassed Windows on Azure entirely. Today, 66% of all customer cores on Azure run Linux, a stat Microsoft itself publishes on its own blog. In 2016, Microsoft launched the Windows subsystem for Linux, putting a full Linux terminal inside Windows. In 2019, they upgraded to WSL2, running an actual Linux kernel inside Windows. That same year, Satya Nadella stood on stage and said, "Microsoft loves Linux." Steve Ballmer, the man who called Linux a cancer, recanted in 2016. "I now see open source as a force for good," he said. Microsoft spent 30 years trying to make Linux irrelevant. Instead, they made themselves dependent on it. October 14th, 2025. Microsoft ended support for Windows 10. Over 240 million PCs were suddenly running an unsupported operating system. Microsoft's solution? Buy a new computer that meets Windows 11's hardware requirements, including a TPM 2.0 chip that hundreds of millions of existing machines don't have, or pay for extended security updates. The Linux community had been waiting for this moment for years. Zorin OS, a Linux distribution designed to look and feel like Windows, surpassed 1 million downloads in just 5 weeks. According to their telemetry, 78% of those downloads came from Windows devices. That's over 780,000 former Windows users migrating to a single Linux distribution. Steam's Linux gaming numbers hit 3.05% in October 2025, the highest ever recorded, and Linux desktop market share crossed 5% in the United States for the first time in history. These numbers sound small until you understand what they represent. Microsoft's entire 30-year strategy was built on one assumption: users will never leave Windows because they don't have a choice. The hardware is locked, the software is incompatible, the learning curve is too steep. Every single one of those barriers has been dismantled. Linux runs on the hardware Microsoft said it couldn't run on. It plays the games Microsoft said it couldn't play. It runs the software Microsoft said it couldn't run. And it costs exactly what it always cost: nothing. The war isn't over. But for the first time in 30 years, Microsoft is losing ground on the one battlefield they thought was permanently theirs. Here's where we are today. Linux runs 78% of the world's web-facing servers. It runs every Android phone, over 3 billion active devices. It runs 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers. It runs the International Space Station. It runs the Large Hadron Collider. It runs the servers that deliver Microsoft's own cloud services. And it was built by volunteers. For free, because they believed software should belong to everyone. Microsoft spent 30 years trying to kill it. They leaked FUD into boardrooms. They secretly funded lawsuits. They paid hardware manufacturers to lock it out of consumer PCs. They had the most powerful CEO in tech call it a cancer on national television. None of it worked. Because you can't kill an idea by attacking the people who believe in it. You only make them more committed. What 30 years of this war proved is something Microsoft still doesn't fully understand. Openness compounds. Every year, Microsoft doubled down on proprietary lock-in. Linux got more transparent, more trusted, more impossible to kill. That trust wasn't built in a boardroom. It was built by millions of people who could read every line of code and verify it for themselves. And every dollar Microsoft spent attacking Linux, on feud, on SEO, on OEM pressure deals, was a dollar they didn't spend making Windows better. They were so busy trying to destroy the competition that they forgot to compete. But the biggest lesson is simpler than all of that. You cannot own what people build together. Microsoft's entire empire was built on the idea that software is property. Linux proved it could be something else, a commons, something that belongs to everyone, and because it belongs to everyone, it can't be taken from anyone. If you ever switched to Linux, if you ever ran a web server on Ubuntu, if you ever used an Android phone, you were part of this. You were the reason 30 years of corporate warfare failed. They bet you'd stay locked in forever. You didn't. And that changed everything. If this story hit different, subscribe, because every week we cover the corporate decisions that shaped your world and the people who refused to accept them. Drop a comment. Do you think Linux will ever crack 10% desktop share? And watch this next, because the next story makes this one look small.